I'm Eric Goldstein. I'm the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here for the annual Tenenbaum lecture featuring Professor Aron Rodrigue from Stanford University. In addition to our very important work in teaching and research, public scholarship forms the third crucial aspect of our mission at the Tam Institute. And the annual Tenenbaum Lecture, now in its third decade, we celebrated the 20th anniversary last year, is the crown jewel in our ongoing efforts to reach the broader community with scholarly insights on Jewish history, culture, and society. As I'm sure many of you who have been regular attendees also know, the Tenenbaum Family Lectureship in Judaic Studies salutes the family of the late Meyer W. Tenenbaum of Savannah, Georgia, a distinguished alumnus of Emory College and the Emory School of Law. The lectureship was established in 1997 by Meyer's son, Samuel Tenenbaum, himself a 1965 graduate of Emory College, and it honors the entire Tenenbaum family and its ethos of citizenship and public service, which is expressed through its support of religious, educational, social service, and arts institutions across the United States. And I'd like to welcome Sam and Inez Tenenbaum and Cookie and Barry Gale, members of the Tenenbaum family who are here with us tonight. Let's please thank them. None of our activities in Jewish studies would be possible without the ongoing support of the leadership of the Emory College of Arts and Sciences. And so it's now my pleasure to invite up our Dean of the college, Michael Elliott, to give a few words of welcome.
So I'll be brief as possible. I'd like to thank Eric and the staff of the Tam Institute for both offering me a chance to welcome you and also saving me a seat, for which I'm going to be very grateful over the next hour and a half. This is a really important event, and I just want to say a quick word about why the Tam Institute is so important to Emory College of Arts and Sciences. All right, at a moment when many people are asking why the liberal arts and sciences matter, if they matter, here at Emory, we believe firmly in the power of the liberal arts and sciences to engage in a mission of creativity and discovery, to have impact on the world. And the teaching and research that goes on in the Tam Institute embodies that mission. We bring together world-class scholars with some of the most fantastic students we can recruit from all over the globe to not just learn about the past, but to ask questions that will transform our study into the future. We bring together scholars and students who have a real desire to have an impact on the world through the public scholarship in popular publications, sometimes on the movie screen, and then in events like this where we invite the community in, and then we make our students sit on the floor. Nothing, I think, really crystallizes what we're trying to do at Emory University better than the room that's here tonight. And I'm just thrilled to see so many of you here. And I'm not going to keep you any longer from the main event, but I also want to extend my own thanks to the Tenenbaum family for their tradition of leadership, for showing why scholarship matters, for showing what it means to be a citizen of the world. We, in our mission at Emory University, can't do it without supporters like you. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dean Elliott. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I would like to thank many of the people who helped make this evening possible. Professor Catherine Dana, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of French and Italian, and also our Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Tam Institute, is the chair of this year's Tenenbaum Lecture Committee, and also Professor Hazel Gold in Spanish and Portuguese Department, also served on the Tenenbaum Organizing Committee. And Catherine and Hazel, whose work often focuses on Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, have long been advocating for a closer examination of the history and culture of Sephardi Jews. And so it was at their urging that we took up this important topic for the focus of this year's Tenenbaum lecture. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsoring units who have supported tonight's event, which include the Hightower Fund, the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Laney Graduate School, the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, the Department of French and Italian Studies, the Department of History, Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and the Department of Religion. And of course, tonight's event would not have been possible without the hard work of the TAM Institute staff. I know I'm going to embarrass somebody, but Mary Jo Duncanson is here. If those of you who have been coming to this lecture for years and years know that Mary Jo was our lead staff person, we call it our academic department administrator, for 13 years, and she retired since last year's lecture. So I just wanted to recognize her and thank her for her many years of service to the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. You raise your hand. Yes. And we're fortunate to have some new staff members. I will introduce Dina Rubenstein Chacham, standing by the door, Megan Kroll, and I also want to thank Mallory Mebab, our third staff member. They really, it's due to them that everything happens. So I just want to recognize them and thank them very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. As I said, within our faculty there has been the ongoing suggestion that we need to focus more on Sephardic history and culture. And besides that, we also were aware that there is a significant historic Sephardic community in Atlanta as well, so we thought that it was important to offer some historical perspective on that. And so we decided to invite Professor Rodrigue, who is truly known as one of the leading experts in this field internationally. Aron Rodrigue is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor of Jewish Culture and History at Stanford University. He specializes in the history and culture of Sephardi Jewries, and he has authored or edited 7 books in the field, including French Jews, Turkish Jews, which is a study of the Alliance Israélite Universelle school system in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which was published in 1990. Sephardi Jewry, A History of the Judeo-Spanish Community, 14th to 20th centuries, published in 2000 and co-authored with Esther Ben-Bassa. And Jews and Muslims, Images of Sephardi and Eastern Jewries in Transition, 1860 to 1939, published in 2003. His latest book is A Jewish Voice from Ottoman Salonika, the Ladino memoir of Saidi Besalel Alevi, which was edited with Sarah Stein, and it presents for the first time the complete text of the earliest known Ladino language memoir, transliterated from the original script, translated into English, and introduced and explicated by the editors. The book brings to life the daily experiences of a Jew in the Ottoman Empire at a time of radical change. Professor Rodrigue is also the recipient of many distinguished international prizes. And from 1993 to 2008, he was the co-editor of one of the leading scholarly journals in Jewish studies called Jewish Social Studies, History, Culture, and Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome him. His title tonight is The Making and Unmaking of Sephardi Jewry, the Ottoman Centuries.
Thank you very much for this gracious and very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Tenenbaum family, the TAM Institute, and Eric Goldstein for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here and to be part of this very prestigious lecture series. And it's a great pleasure to return to Atlanta for the first time in over 20 years. I have not been here for a long time. I will give a kind of survey, but as well as take a step back and talk about a very important part of the Jewish world that came into being in a particular period and that has all but disappeared as a unit where it had been and it lived for centuries. We all know about the expulsion from Spain in 1492, and subsequent expulsions from the Iberian Peninsula, and departures, and the Inquisition, and that part of a major change in the Jewish world. What used to be arguably the demographically largest Jewish community in the world essentially disappears and ceases to exist by the beginning of the 16th century. We've heard, I think all of you have heard, that, of course, many Sephardic Jews, the bulk of them, went to Muslim lands, most notably to the Ottoman Empire, but also significant numbers, very large numbers, to North Africa as well. And it is the Ottoman part of the story that I'll be looking at today. It's known, of course, that the Jews lived for centuries in the Ottoman Empire, but how did they come into creating a new Jewish community in the East? How did this community structure itself, lived over the centuries? What kind of distinctive trajectories did it take? And how did it begin to change, transform itself, and eventually go under as a distinct Jewish community in the course of the 20th century? These are some of the questions I'm going to ask. I'm not going to give a straightforward history of this because obviously this would take an entire semester, if not an entire year. And much as I would love to do that, I think we have time constraints here. And what I will do is highlight certain aspects of this history and ask questions, try to provide some answers, and make some observations, because I've been working on this topic for decades, and the more one works on something, the more questions, the more issues arise, and certain new answers appear. And so I will zoom in and zoom out in many ways into this community, the Ottoman centuries, that is to say, southeastern Europe, and today's Asia Minor, Anatolia. I will not be talking about the Jews of the Arab lands, and very few Jews actually, even though they did, the Jews in Arab lands of the Levant were mostly originated from elsewhere. Some Jews, of course, eventually made their way to Egypt and Ottoman Palestine, but the bulk of the core group that left Spain, that also kept a certain Spanish or Iberian characteristic, was mostly located, they were mostly located in southeastern Europe, that is to say in the current countries of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, and Turkey. Those were the core area of Judeo-Spanish culture and civilization that eventually remade itself as an Ottoman civilization of its own, a very important part of the Ottoman Empire's fabric. And the Ottoman Empire, as you know, is an extraordinary empire that lasted for more than 500 years, that begins to rise at the beginning of the 14th century, and that goes on till the beginning of the 20th century, when it disappears at the end of World War I in 1918. But before we talk about this new Sephardi community, it's important to realize that there were actually Jews there before. These were Byzantine Jews, Greek-speaking Jews, and indeed they'd been there for 1,000 years or more. These were part of the old Hellenic world. And these Jews had their own distinctive liturgy, their customs, their culture. Nobody really talks about these Jews anymore because the notion is somehow that everything starts in 1492. But I think it's worth to think about what it meant to be part of a historic Jewish community, small, relatively small in number, and then all of a sudden tens of thousands of Jews from other parts of the world arriving. This is not unique to this part of the world. This has happened before in Jewish history. The United States, most notably. Initially, there were Sephardic Jews in the United States. Then came large numbers German Jews. And of course, they were swamped in terms of numbers at the end of the 19th century onwards by Russian, East European Jews that arrived in much larger numbers and came to dominate. This is, in fact, a story that happened to these Greek-speaking Jews, the Romaniot Jews, as they were known, from Rome, Second Rome, Byzantium, Romaniot. That's where the name comes from. It refers to Rome because that part of the world was part of the Roman Empire that survived the destruction of Western Roman Empire in 476. 1453 is the fall of Constantinople, and then the rise of the new city, Istanbul, as a new capital. But already in the 14th century, the Ottomans were in the Balkans, had conquered large parts of that part of the world, and had new Jewish communities already in place. So it's very important, I think, to reflect that year zero of Ottoman Jewry is not 1492. There was already a Jewish presence in Ottoman lands long before the Ottomans arrived, long before the Turks arrived. I say this because to this day, in Turkey, which is the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, the Jews who arrived, the Jewish community as a whole, is usually referred to as a guest community, misafir. They were not a guest community because there were Jews there before, in fact, the arrival of the Ottomans. And there's a problem of the notion of a guest community which denaturalizes their place there and is open to making them, even 5 centuries later, foreigners. So what I'm trying to say here is that Sephardic Jewry, by its very concept of its being a transplanted Jewry as a guest community, has also political implications for the rootedness of Jews in the Eastern Mediterranean, that part of the world. And it is an issue that people can forget very easily about the diversity, in fact, of what happened to be Sephardic Jewry. Now, the local Jews, in large numbers arrived, and the local Jews, Romaniot Jews, were eventually assimilated into the arriving Sephardic Jews, the Jewish community, but not without a struggle. The rabbis initially did not accept the people who are coming from elsewhere, different rites and rituals, different languages, the usual story in the Jewish world of different communities beginning to fight with each other over which way is the best, and all of that going on. But for example, in Istanbul, it is really only in the 17th century, towards the end of the 17th century, that Romaniot Jewry loses its hold on communal institutions. Only some names will survive among these Romaniot Jews, some Greek names, some distinctive names, Kalo, Philosophe, Polycarp, Stamati. These are only names, even though now they become entirely Sephardic names and Sephardic families. So, the story is, in fact, a very interesting one of a newly arrived community imposing itself through demographic numbers onto local existing communities. Now, the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula who went to North Africa, for example, to Morocco, to Algeria, to Tunisia, went in large numbers, but they did not demographically dominate and were, in fact, absorbed by the local Arab-speaking communities and became Arabized or Judeo-Arabized. Whereas in the Ottoman lands, the numbers were so large that they became the dominant community. And this is a demographic fact of life of a lot of immigrant communities and elsewhere. But I want to complicate, as I said, the story of no Jews, and Spanish and Iberian Jews, then moving across the Eastern Mediterranean, and then striking root as a new community altogether. It's not that easy. The other part of the story is also very interesting. The Ottoman Empire had a particular policy, like many empires, by the way, but it was very, very strongly marked, of moving Jewish populations around. moving all populations around, including the Jews. So they moved Muslim groups from one place to another. They moved Greeks, Armenians, Turkic tribes. They moved them around sometimes for strategic regions and sometimes for resettlement policies. The resettlement policies meant that in a situation where you're creating a new empire and where there's been a lot of warfare, you need new populations that are economically useful, and you give them privileges, but you move them from one place to another in order to repopulate cities that are in ruin, to recreate trade routes, to actually revive life in certain areas. So this was the case in Istanbul, Constantinople, which was in ruins, and the Ottomans moved a lot of Turks, Muslims, Jews, and others from elsewhere. These were Byzantine Jews, and indeed, if we look at the record of the Jewish congregations in Istanbul in the course of the 16th century, we have some very interesting divisions, because there will be a community that will be known as Gerush, which is the Hebrew word for exile, expelled, and so there is that community which for a long time historians thought were in fact referring to the ones who had been exiled and expelled from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula, but we now know that these were local Greek-speaking Jews from other cities that had been brought together, hence they called themselves as the exiled, expelled community. And it had nothing to do with the Iberian Peninsula, and as opposed to another community, for example, which would be called in the Turkish words kendi gelen, which means came on their own, which means they came on their own will and were not exiled. They're not part of the system. The technical name for the system is the word sürgün in Turkish, which can mean, in the current meaning, means actually punitive expulsion, but in the Ottoman sense also meant something close to fertilizing or making something live again. So it had a positive meaning. So by the 16th century, we have in place major new Jewish communities. The Jewish community of Salonika emerges because the Ottomans actually directed Jews to what had become a very poor port city at the tail end of major trade routes across the Balkans. So the arrival of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire is not necessarily only an act of toleration, of saying, okay, we believe in all of these movement of peoples, but it was designated strategically to repopulate certain areas, and also with a population that was not likely to pose political threats. So in 1478, in the first Ottoman census of Thessaloniki or Salonika, there are no Jews, because they'd all been moved in 1453. They'd moved, in the course of the second half of the 15th century to Istanbul. But by 1520s, there are over 25,000 Jews, which makes it the largest Jewish community in the world. Just to give you a comparative study, a comparative dimension, Prague at that time has 1,000 Jews, Venice about 3,000, Amsterdam a century later is going to have 3,000, and there is no other major Jewish urban center as large as Salonika in that period anywhere else in the world. Now, what kind of culture did these Jews bring with themselves? And here I will speak a little bit about Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, Spanish, whatever the language was. It's interesting in this respect to reflect upon what really happened. There was no entity called Spain in 1492. It's the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, of course, that creates a union of crowns that is the embryonic Spain that will eventually get other territories. Jews had lived in towns and villages and cities in Spain speaking the local dialects. There was, in fact, no normative, standardized Spanish. In Catalonia, of course, it was Catalan. In Castile, Castilian, but even those were not, in fact, standardized. So the Jews took with them, there were some texts in Spanish, in Spain, of Spanish, or certain types of Spanish written in Hebrew script, just like Yiddish was going to be a written Hebrew script. So this was the Jews always wrote, because of their education system, the languages they were involved with in Hebrew script, because there was no common school. The church education was usually Christian and in Latin and other things. So Jews had their own schooling, and the script they were taught to read and write was always the Hebrew script. So it was normal that this language was written in Hebrew script, transliterated into Hebrew. They come from throughout the Iberian Peninsula and from Portugal later on. And it is only in the Ottoman Empire that merges and begins to emerge one type of Spanish with words from all the different dialects in Spain, very much influenced also by Hebrew, just like in Yiddish, lots and lots of Hebrew words, and then slowly words from Turkish, from Greek, from Bulgarian, other surrounding groups where these Jews were. And there we begin to see the rise of a new Jewish language. So it is not, unlike what a lot of people think, medieval Spanish that is frozen in time, that is transplanted, but it's actually a new form of very much Spanish, but a very different kind of Spanish that begins to emerge. Its roots, it remains a Romance language written in Hebrew script, but very strongly influenced by Hebrew and the rabbinical textual tradition. The referent language is Hebrew. So, in the first literature that we begin to see, we have the translations of major Jewish liturgical and other kind of things, and the word they use in the preface of these books that are being usually translation of the Bible by 1540s and other translations, most notably the Passover Seder or the Agadah that is used in the Seder is going to be in Ladino. But why the word Ladino? Because the word they use is enladinado, which means Ladino, Latin, turned into a Latin language. That is where the word Ladino comes from. So the word will be enladinado by this person, that translator, etc. And then people began to call it Ladino in the written format. By the way, this has given rise to a huge debate about what to call this language, because some people say, oh no, it's only the translating language, it's called Ladino, and the other words should be used for this. At the end of the 19th century, European scholars begin to use the word Judeo-Espanol in French, or Judeo-Spanish, and that's been adopted. Others use the word Judesmo from Judaismo or Judesmo, but the Jews themselves, on the whole, if you ask them what they spoke, they would not have said Ladino. They would not have said Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Espanol. They would have said Espanol. They spoke Spanish. Or they would say Nuestro Español, our Spanish. So it's a kind of a different part of a whole language, but Ladino became then the way in which the people who translated the text use the word, but to this day, for those communities that come from that part of the world, it is rare to call it Ladino. However, eventually the word begins to gain ground, and it is perhaps closer to a more authentic usage than Judeo-Spanish, which is really very much what Western scholars call it. So it would be equivalent to say this Judeo-Spanish would be the equivalent to say for Yiddish, Judeo-German. There is, in fact, a Judeo-German, which is a different story, but it would not be. It would be the same kind of thing. Yet one doesn't do that with Yiddish, so I don't know why we do it with Ladino. But anyway, so Judeo-Spanish is become also common today, but it's a kind of complicated history and trajectory of this language. So Ladino emerges as an Ottoman language, with roots in Spain, heavily influenced by Hebrew. It is the vernacular language of the people, the vernacular language. And for many centuries, it will be used in the street, but if you're a scholar, or you want to write anything that is significant, you wrote it in Hebrew. This is true also of Yiddish, the Yiddish-speaking world. Up until the 19th century, mid-19th century, the language of high culture is Hebrew. Yiddish and Ladino are the vernacular languages. And it's only in the modern period that it will start to begin to change. And the big change to Ladino, and here is a very important point, is the mid-17th century. The mid-17th century, what happens in mid-17th century? The mid-17th century in 1666 is the rise of Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, which is a big Jewish messianic movement that will impact the entire Sephardi world, but also the Ashkenazi world. Has huge impact in Amsterdam, in Poland, in Russia, I mean what is now Russia, in Poland, Lithuanian Kingdom. This is he's a messianic figure. He says, we are now all going to go back to the Holy Land. He abrogates the law. In the end, he is captured by the Sultan because he's accused by the rabbis of being a troublemaker, and the Sultan would almost always do what the rabbis, if they identify somebody, would do what they wanted. But not before tens of thousands of people believed in him. So we begin very shortly thereafter, in the next 50 years, the rise of a rabbinical written literature in Ladino, which is, in fact, the usage of Ladino to re-educate the masses. That is to say, because before then, all religious texts, all edifying and moral texts are written in Hebrew. The idea begins to develop, so the masses are gullible. If we do not really teach them in their own language, because they don't understand Hebrew, because that's part of a whole small elite, then they will be susceptible to be influenced by this messianic kind of nonsense. And so the rabbis begin, and the most important Ladino book emerges in that period, which will be in every Sephardic household in the Ottoman Empire by the end of the 19th century. And that book, it's going to be an encyclopedic series called Me'am Lo'ez, from the language, from the foreign tongue, from the foreign people, Lo'ez, Loazit, from the Hebrew Loazit, which means vernacular, and which means non-Hebrew. This begins to be a big text explaining the Bible and explaining the rabbinical tradition, and through commentaries in Ladino written by rabbis. It's a vast encyclopedia, by the way. It exists in English. It's been translated entirely in English. Unfortunately, it was first translated into Hebrew in the 20th century, and the translation through English is through the Hebrew. So it's several layers removed, but this is a very important text, and from that time on, it became acceptable for rabbis and everybody else to use the vernacular, and we begin to see the rise of a literature in Ladino in this part of the world. Very little known, but actually hundreds of books, eventually newspapers, all kinds of publications that begin to appear in this period. So what I've been trying to suggest is up until now, a complicated beginnings of the new Sepharad, and in fact the coming into being of an Ottoman Sepharad, and a distinctive language that emerges at that particular period, far from what the 19th century scholars who rediscover, Western scholars, especially Spanish scholars, who rediscover this language and say, oh, but it's frozen Spanish from the 16th century, from the 15th, 16th century, is actually a new type of language that has emerged at this particular period. So these are the two important elements here. The third element is the profound Ottoman nature of these communities. These are not Spaniards living in exile. These become Ottoman Jews. By the 17th century onwards, you can imagine they're living in an Ottoman reality. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, the cities they live in Istanbul, in Edirne or Adrianople, in Salonika or Thessaloniki, in Sarajevo, in Izmir, in Rhodes, in all of these kinds of all these communities, they are embedded in the Ottoman world, which is in fact polyglot world. It's a world where everybody knew in some ways their place, where people would barter and change things in the bazaar, but when they went home, they were within their own communities with boundaries between communities that are very well established, with a hierarchy where the Muslim power is, of course, by definition, the dominant power, which protects and tolerates non-Muslims in return for an extra taxation that takes place, as long as the non-Muslims knew their place. That is, say, as, indeed, in a hierarchical relationship, socially and politically disenfranchised. But that was all the Jews wanted anyway. They had no illusions. The traditional Jewish mode was that they were all in exile, and all they wanted was to be left alone, to do their business, to actually live their communal life, to be run by the Jewish law. The notion of equality is a modern concept. It did not obtain in any part of the world for centuries. So in some ways, sometimes people say, oh, but non-Muslims were second-class citizens in the Muslim world, where there is no citizen. But this is true in Christian Europe and throughout the world itself. So one has to be very careful when we use these words, second-class citizen, when the very concept of citizenship based on equality does not exist. What happens is a rapid Ottomanization of this community. And in this Ottomanization, we have massive assimilation into local cultural modes and culture and other ways. I'll give you two examples. Assimilation in food ways. Food history, by the way, is very important. It's very important to trace what happens in terms of food, the adoption of local food practices. By the way, that's kind of easy in a Muslim-dominant society where there is no pork, really, except in the Christian communities. But so it's relatively easy in a dominant group not having pork. But local items, local customs all becoming part of the world. People did not live in isolated, hermetically sealed communities. They lived in the world where they were, and they all shopped in the same bazaars. They all went to the same grocery shops, and all of those things. So we have, in fact, a pan-Eastern Mediterranean cuisine that gets adopted by all the groups in that part of the world. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Bulgarians. There is a whole substratum of a similar food, sometimes given the same names, each now bitterly fought after, but who invented it first, which nobody knows, with a few things brought from Spain that sometimes still exist. So for example, this item called pan de España, which is a particular kind of a bread, particular kind of pastry, actually, that is, there are few remnants of the Spanish stuff, but it would be completely untrue to say that Sephardi cuisine has much to do with Spanish cuisine. it is Ottoman cuisine. It shares a 90%, 99% with the surrounding cuisines of the Eastern Mediterranean, and this is not surprising. So the other one, by the way, which is very little studied, is in fact is music. I don't know how many of you are aware, but Sephardic, that is, the Eastern Mediterranean, liturgical music, Jewish music, religious music, is Ottoman Muslim high court culture music. It has very little to do with any earlier traditions. It's complete adaptation of the high cultural register taken into the synagogue level and adapted so that very frequently, if you don't hear it, if you don't listen very carefully, you would think it's actually Ottoman high culture music, whereby until you kind of listen to the Hebrew words that are appearing, and it's at that moment that you realize that this is a completely different genre onto its own. In fact, there were some very major Jewish musicians that emerged that actually even teach sultans music in many ways. Last but not least, there's extensive involvement in popular music and eventually in choirs that are together of Sufi music and Sufi orders, where the Jews and Muslims and Greeks will sometimes partake of the same tradition, and there will emerge certain choirs that are actually exchanging musical traditions onto its own. This is a very little studied aspect of this history, but I think one can find out a lot. All of this I'm mentioning is that by the 19th century, when we're coming towards the modern period, we have essentially a Levantine Ottoman community that has deep roots in that area, that is part of the Ottoman social reality in every city. And then we begin to see major changes. And the major changes have a lot to do with the incursion of the West in that part of the world. This will affect, in fact, the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, and we live with its consequences to our own day. Industrialization of Europe, the arrival of steamships, the domination of finished products invading local markets, the defeat of the Ottomans by armies from Russia, from the Habsburg Empire, beginning the retreat in the Balkans of the Ottomans. All of these are profound shocks to the system, as they were, of the Ottoman Empire. So what we have is the reorientation of the Ottoman elite, which begins to try to adopt Western techniques, and it's part of a story that Middle Eastern regimes to this day will begin to adopt, to do what I would call defensive Westernization. Let's say you adopt the armaments, the techniques, the military, and all of that, and try to survive in a very complicated geostrategic location. And not last but least, in this era of change, the rise of nationalism. The rise of nationalism, heralded first by the Serbian uprising in the first decade of the 19th century. Then, of course, the major turning point, 1821, the Greek revolt, which is an enormous shock to the Ottoman system, which will displace, in fact, the Greek ruling families from their privileged place in the Ottoman court. And then eventually, in 1878, the Bulgarian uprising and the new state of Bulgaria, so new state of Serbia, the new state of Greece. All of these are part of this Sephardic Ottoman world, which is now entering new states. It's gone through a fragmentation. For centuries, they had one ruler, one Ottoman system, one Muslim world that dominated, and the commonality of all of these Jews. So a Jew who moved from Sarajevo to Izmir was in the same cultural realm. They all spoke Ladino, they all had the Ottoman world. Now they become something else as they're moving. A Jew from Belgrade, which has a very large Sephardic community until the Holocaust, who moved to Bulgaria or to Greece or to Rhodes would find himself or herself in a known universe. 50 years later, that is gone. They are now subjects or citizens of new entities that have arisen. The whole world is fragmenting into a new political arrangement that is no longer trans-ethnic, trans-religious, imperial entity, but a national entity. And then something begins to happen, which is a big problem for the Jews. One always asks the questions, is it good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, in terms of a lot of these things that happen? Well, historically, it's nothing to do with Jews. If you are a minority, it is better to be one among multiple minorities and not to be the only minority. So if you're in an Ottoman situation where there are lots and lots of other groups, you are never the only other. Once you move into a nation state where everybody is Christian, or everybody is Muslim, and you are the only minority, it can only mean trouble. Because you become the other. And you become the repository of all the phantasmagoric or fantasies that people can have, becomes the scapegoat, becomes this traditional kind of thing. So the empires are always better for multi-ethnic areas, but nation states taken to their logical conclusion first have to create a minority that is another, because minority as a political concept did not exist before, because the majority is supposed to be represented by the nation state. And then eventually that minority has to be either assimilated or at best disappear. So implicit in the logic, and this is a fairly tendentious statement that I'm saying, but in illiberal areas, implicit in the logic of the nation state is the possibility of ethnic cleansing. Because it to this day does not know how to deal with others. Because somebody has to define who is the majority. And by defining the majority, you also define the minority who doesn't fit. By definition, a majority has groups of people who are not part of the majority. And unless you find a way of toleration and also a respect of all those kind of groups, which is rarity in history, you have a very problematic and fraught statement. So for the first time, we begin to see in these nation states anti-Semitic movements in the modern sense of the word. Not the old sense of like conflicts and frictions and whatever, but we have real problem about Jews becoming, and this is a word that I've seen used in Turkey in the 1930s, native foreigners. The word is literally used, native foreigners. And that's true in Greece, that's true in Bulgaria, that's true in other places. All of a sudden, people who were autochthonous and there for centuries become foreigner by definition of their not being part of the majority. So this whole situation begins to be extremely fraught. There was also another element of the arrival of the West, which was very, very important. And culturally, the situation of the Jews was that culturally they had also begun to change. And here I return to my topics that had been mentioned earlier in my first study. The French Jews who had a whole mission to modernize and westernize Jews along the Mediterranean through their organization, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, created a vast network of schools in the Middle East and North Africa. And in the space of 2 generations, from the end of from the second half of the 19th century onwards, traditional education mass education was displaced by French Jewish schooling, which meant that these communities all became Francophone communities. French became a fixture of being Sephardi, French language and culture, that lasted really up until a generation or two ago. And of course, this was different in North Africa. There was a colonial arrangement, but elsewhere also, the language of education and culture of modern Sephardi Jewry was French. And it marked these Jews very strongly. But that had also an unintended consequence. You have a local Jewish community that was very deeply native. All of a sudden, they have an imported from the West educational system, which complicates the situation when the new states that will arrive want one language, one culture, one state, a uniform state, and the dreaded West is there in one community that makes it even more foreign than it was supposed to be. So French is a marker of difference. There's assimilation towards French culture, but it's not the local culture. You see? So when the new nation state arises, you have a whole set of problems saying, why are this what became very notorious in Turkey? Why are these people speaking French? Why on earth are they not speaking Turkish? Why are they not in? And of course, then it's made compulsory. This is true in Greece, compulsory closing of these schools as of 1925. It's true in Turkey, 1925. It's true, by the way, for those of you with Rhodes origin in this community, it's true of Italian Rhodes, where the island of Rhodes had been conquered by the Italians, and Italian is imposed as of 1924, 1925. So we have what we could call the nationalization project towards all minorities. Jews are not unique in this respect, but they will have to adjust for an imperial reality to this new reality. So we have a lot of changes that really begin to take place in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the rise of new nation states. By the way, all of these we would call successor states to the Ottoman Empire. All of the Balkan states that I've talked, including Turkey, which is the last successor state. And the successor states have a much more complicated relationship with the Jews than the Ottoman situation, which for all of its problems in terms of hierarchical relationship had what I've characterized in my writings the stance of what I would call benign neglect towards the Jews. Jews were not significant. Unlike what a lot of Jewish historians and Jewish perspectives mean, Jews were not at the center of everything in terms of the way they thought. They were one of many things. So that imperial setting, and I'm not really arguing from a nostalgia point of view, I'm really talking about kind of a certain Ottoman social reality, is a setting which allowed certain type of autonomy and laissez-faire attitude towards a lot of these communities. So when we come to think of the Sephardic world, we have Ladino, we have Hebrew, we have French, and then to this will be added Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian, all of this jockeying for positions, and eventually will mean inevitably the decline and fall of the Jewish language Ladino. I like to say that Jewish languages, or languages without states behind them that put them forth, are destined to die. And with the sole exception being sometimes rich communal organizational life, sometimes trying to maintain it. But in the long run, in the modern world, unless a language is taught at the school level, at the elementary school level, unless children speak it naturally with each other, those languages are on their way out. The only exception in Yiddish is because of the ultra-Orthodox community that keeps it going, but it is largely true for Yiddish also, except for this particular group. So Ladino retreats totally to the home language. In these new nation states, there is no more literature that was produced by the 1920s and 30s. The last Ladino newspaper, El Mensajero, was published in Thessaloniki or Salonika until the arrival of the Germans. And that is the last one that was published in the old Hebrew script that it was printed in. So Ladino retreats, and eventually the Jews begin to make headway from a transition from the Ottoman centuries to the nation-state decades. But that is the whole story. The nation-state decades are only decades, because there are two forces that interfere. One totally extraneous, one that I've already mentioned, that is to say, the transformation of the Jews from a millet, a Jewish separate community to a minority, and eventually the push towards emigration, mass departures for the Americas, for British Palestine at that period, towards Latin America. The conscription, going to the army, begins to be a very big problem. And then, of course, the Holocaust. Because unlike what is frequently mentioned or not known, unlike what is thought, Sephardic Jewry was affected by the Holocaust. Most notably in Greece, where the Germans deported the communities of Greece between 1943 and 44, from Belgrade and Bosnia. In Bulgaria, it doesn't enter the war, but it keeps its own Jews, but expels the Jews and hands them over to the Germans when in newly acquired territories in northern Greece and Macedonia. In Turkey, a virulent anti-Semitic moment of a wealth tax. So with the rise of the State of Israel, what has happened is that the remnant communities of the old Sephardic world, now profoundly troubled by the Holocaust, will begin to emigrate en masse. So what we now have in the middle of the 19th century is the complete dissolution of what used to be an Ottoman unit. That is to say, one important part of the Jewish world that lasted 4 centuries, we would say, as a very much a kind of imperial Ottoman community. We see in the middle of the 19th century not only the disintegration, but the dissolution and disappearance of this unit. So as far as these groups that we're talking about, it would be fair to say that the world that they had known, which was an Ottoman world, with the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire, lasts only 30 more years, until the mid of the 20th century. There are then remnant communities that remain, few in Bulgaria, more sizable but rapidly declining in Turkey, very few in Serbia, and it's all scattered to many parts of the world where the specificity of the unit no longer can be transmitted. The descendants become part of a new reality. They merge with other Jewish communities, and they continue the traditions up to a certain point. But once removed from its Ottoman setting, there is simply no way that this part of the Jewish world is possible to kind of maintain itself. And Ladino culture itself dies out 5 centuries after the expulsion from Spain. So what we have actually witnessed in the 20th century, to put it in comparative perspective, is the disappearance of 2 major Jewish traditional worlds. The Ashkenazi world of Eastern Europe and the Sephardi world of Southeastern Europe and Asia Minor. Interestingly, both of these worlds had come into being at the end of the Middle Ages, when Jews had moved from the Rhineland and Germany towards Poland, Lithuania, and had moved from the Iberian Peninsula to the east. And those 2 major Jewish centers of the world in the 20th century disappear and go under, to be replaced by 2 other essentially very major Jewish units, the United States and Israel. So we have witnessed really in the course of the 20th century, by the mid-20th century, a massive, massive dislocation and disintegration of the traditional Jewish worlds. And I have given you perhaps a glimpse of the counterpart of the Ashkenazi world south of the Danube towards the Mediterranean, and its mirror fate in some ways, because ultimately the 20th century catches up with both of the communities. I'll end here. Thank you.